Maurice Nicoll, Psychological Commentary, Volume 2. Based on his work with Gurdjieff, this group was in Birdlip, January 7, 1945. It's titled Commentary on Memory, Part 1. On one occasion, Mr. Gurdjieff, in so many words, in speaking on the first conscious shock, man should remember himself, and he was born to do so. If you ask me what the work is about at this stage, it's about self-remembering. At this place in the 3 octaves, something is missing in the present state of humanity. Therefore, it is necessary to give the shock of self-remembering, which should be given naturally. The trouble is that even when people begin to understand what self-remembering means, they forget to remember themselves. It is necessary to create a memory for self-remembering, and for this reason one must take many alarm clocks to wake oneself up. People may even wish to remember themselves, but they forget to remember that they have to remember themselves. On another occasion, he spoke about the different kinds of memory that we have, and in his earlier teaching, Mr. Ouspensky explained to us that we must try to observe different kinds of memory in ourselves. He said each center, each part of a center, and each subdivision of a center had its own kind of memory. This means that each eye has its own memory because eyes are arranged in a certain order and live in these different parts of centers. We have, for example, very trivial memories which really belong to small eyes in small parts of centers. We remember how we lost a bus or a train years ago and so on. Now, Mr. Ouspensky said that all memories are necessary, but he spoke about the education of memory, saying that if we can only remember small things, we cannot remember big things. And if we always remember, or that we always lived in small eyes, we could not, for example, remember the work. He said that every part of the center is useful except the negative part of the emotional center. He added that the negative part of the emotional center is unfortunately divided into smaller and bigger parts, just as every other part of a center is. For bigger or more internal part of the negative part of the emotional center is capable of remembering insults all one's life. This is not trivial memory. On the contrary, such deep negative emotions make a man wait for years to have his revenge. The reason why it is more persistent is because it is in bigger eyes in the negative parts of the emotional center. Small eyes forget. Bigger eyes remember more persistently. Some people have very deep-seated negative memory that destroys their lives. You know, perhaps people who say that they will never forgive or forget. It is curious how they take a certain pride in saying this, but it is like a deep ulcer in which in them and will always bind them to life and hold them down and prevent in any new way of thinking and feeling. Now let us stop speaking about unpleasant forms of memory with which most of our lives are filled. Let us try to think of obviously different kinds of memory, since every center and every part of a center and every subdivision of a center has a different kind of memory. We should expect to observe different kinds of memory in life. For example, people have a very good memory for tunes, but cannot remember the words of a song, whereas some people can remember the words but not the tune. Here obviously are 2 different kinds of memory. Again, some people may remember ordinary tunes and some may remember the whole operas. These again are different memories of which we might say that those who remember ordinary tunes remember in a smaller part of the center, And those who remember whole operas remember in a bigger part. Again, some people remember figures very well, impersonally or personally. They remember impersonal things like the national debt, or more personally, the rate of interest on some investment, or still more personally, the fares to somewhere. They figure out things to calculate, or they figure out things and calculate. This is quite a different memory from mathematical calculation or from higher mathematics. It is connected, but mathematics is in a higher part of the center. A capacity for figuring we might put in the formatory center, but a capacity for mathematics we must put it in at least the emotional part of the intellectual center, and a capacity for higher mathematics probably in the intellectual part of the intellectual center. We will remind ourselves later on as to what has been said about the different parts of centers and their subdivisions. Now, some people have a very good memory for faces, probably with no names attached. On the other hand, people may remember names very well. You may have a good memory for what has happened in your lives as regard to purely external events, whereas other people do not have this memory clearly, but remember their psychological states, how they felt, what they thought. Some people cannot remember a book, but can remember the ideas contained in it, and so on. Sometimes there are very highly developed forms of memory, as in youthful prodigies, who can remember, let us say, a whole column of a newspaper read out loud to them at once, or who have an extraordinary memory for historical dates. Generally speaking, prodigious memory of this limited kind is a bad sign, because it becomes the precocious development of one small part of a center at the expense of the development of all other parts. There are many examples of different kinds of memory, but it is impossible to give them here. But I would advise you to see where your memory is good and where it is bad. All memories have their uses. The main point is to realize there are many different kinds of memory, and these different kinds of memory have different qualities. Mr. Ouspensky said somewhere that some people took pleasure in saying that they were absent-minded, like the professor who always forgot his umbrella. He was speaking of the idea of balanced man in whom all centers work equally, that is, not one-sided man or a small part man. He said it would be necessary, if this professor came into the work, for him to learn never to forget his umbrella, because it meant that there was something missing in him. Now, in using these different kinds of memory, we should realize first that there are different kinds of memory and that we should be able to call them up when necessary. For example, I may not remember a great many things at this moment, but I should be able to remember when called upon. I want to say something here about memory that you may not understand. Memory does not mean always remembering everything, such as what bus to catch, how to cook a goose, how to add up figures, how to drive a car, what you read last year, or what you learned in school.